I heard my husband, Richard, charged $100 an hour for private tutoring a student of his. Chloe was practically begging me to save a spot for her in my past life. I felt sorry for her and agreed a month later. Rumors spread like wildfire across the school that Richard had put his hands on her during their tutoring sessions. The day the school issued the official suspension notice, Richard locked himself in his study and never stood on a teacher's podium again. Our daughter, Haley, was pointed out by her classmates who whispered, and quote, "Your dad's a creep," end quote. She cried every day and refused to go to school. My mother-in-law, Nancy, had trash thrown at her at the local grocery store. The neighbors avoided us like the plague. Meanwhile, Chloe took a minor bruise report to a local news station for an exclusive Brave Girl Speaks Out interview. She walked away with a $300,000 settlement from the school and was praised all over TikTok as a hero for speaking her truth. But now I had been reborn. Chloe pushed open my office door looking desperate. And quote, "Please, Sophia, just let me join Richard's prep class. I really need this." I behind my desk, my face completely expressionless. And quote, "Sorry, we aren't doing private tutoring this year," end quote. Chloe froze. She clearly didn't expect me to reject her so flatly. The office was dead silent. Paul, who worked at the desk now next to mine, peeked over his partition. Chloe lowered her head, clutching the straps of her backpack so hard her knuckles turned white. Her voice sounded fragile like it was about to crack, but I asked, and quote, "Around they said Mr. Richard always takes a prep group before the SATs. My math score is terrible. He's the only teacher whose explanations actually make sense to me, Sophia. I know my family isn't rich, but I'll find a way to pay the tuition. I promise," end quote. I heard this exact speech in my past life. Back then, I was stupid. I thought I was helping a struggling kid survive the college admissions race. I had even paid for her first week's fees out of my own pocket. And what did I get in return? She dragged Richard into the mud and stepped on my family's bleeding bodies to climb her way to fame. Looking at her watery, innocent eyes, now my stomach turned with pure disgust at Chloe. The school adjusted the curriculum this year. Richard is not taking any extra students. Her lips trembled. Can I just stand in the back of the classroom? Then I won't take up a seat and I won't distract anyone. Number, what if I only listen to the last 10 minutes of number? With every no, I dropped the look of victimization on her face grew deeper. Soon a few other teachers gathered near the office door. For one of them whispered to me, and quote, "Sophia, she's practically begging you. Don't be so heartless," end quote. Yeah, her scores are tanking. If she doesn't get them up, she'll have to retake the SAT next year, poor girl. Richard is used to working hard. Anyway, one more student won't hurt him. I looked up at them in my past life. It was these exact guilt trips that backed me into a corner. Just help her. You're both educators. You shouldn't just care about the money. It's a kid's future. Don't be so cold. Yet, when the scandal broke, these were the very first people to run away and delete us from their contacts. No one remembered that they were the ones who forced her into our lives in the first place. Seeing people take her side, Chloe's tears fell even faster. I don't want to cause trouble, Sophia. I just really want to go to a good college. My dad's back is ruined from construction work and my mom washes dishes at a diner. They told me if I don't get a scholarship, I can't go. Bent forward, trying to give me a dramatic apologetic bow. I fast stepping aside to avoid it. And quote, "Don't do that," end quote. She froze mid-motion, a flash of humiliation crossing her eyes. I stared at her coldly. And quote, "If you want to study, do it, but don't put on a show in my office," end quote. Just then, Mr. Harrison, the vice principal, walked in frowning. And quote, "What is going on here?" end quote. Chloe looked at him like he was her savior and immediately turned to him. And quote, "Mr. Harrison, I wanted to sign up for Mr. Richard's math prep class, but Sophia said he's not doing it this year," end quote. Mr. Harrison glanced at me. And quote, "Not doing it? Why wasn't I informed?" end quote. I replied calmly. And quote, "Richard's schedule is completely packed. Doesn't have the time or energy for extra work," end quote. Mr. Harrison's face darkened. And quote, "Sophia, you work in administration. You know we have to look at the bigger picture. Chloe is one of our priority students this semester. Richard is one of our top teachers. He shouldn't be picky about his students," end quote. I let out a soft laugh. And quote, "Mr. Harrison, are we talking about an officially approved school program or an unofficial private arrangement?" end quote. He choked on his words, unable to answer. The office went completely silent. Private prep schools have incredibly strict rules. Me after-school tutoring must go through the school's billing system. Schedules, invoices, and parental consent forms are mandatory in my past life. Chloe's smartest move was framing a standard after-school Q and AMP, a session as a private secret meeting. This time I was going to leave her zero gray areas. Mr. Harrison cleared his throat. And quote, "Of course, First It is an official school program. Great. And we'll follow standard protocol. We'll use the AV recording room. We need her parents' signed consent and all tutoring sessions must take place directly under the school's security cameras," end quote. Chloe snapped her head up, her face turning pale for a split second, but Mr. Harrison didn't notice. He just nodded. "Fine, let's do." I looked at Chloe here. "But if you really want to study, we play by the rules." She bit her lip, waiting a long time before finally nodding. Okay, but the sheer resentment in her eyes did not escape me. That night, I pulled Richard out onto the balcony. He had just finished grading a mountain of tests. His glasses were still resting on the bridge of his nose, and he looked exhausted. "What is wrong?" "Hey." I looked at him, my throat tightening. The last time he stood on a podium in my past life, he looked exactly like this. A crisp white shirt, black-rimmed glasses, and chalk dust on his cuffs. But later, he would flinch every time his phone buzzed. The vile comments online had acted like razor blades, slicing away his dignity piece by piece. He had done absolutely nothing wrong. Yet, he was forced to explain himself over and over again to a mob that didn't care. There is no smoke without fire. They had said. I took a deep breath. Starting tomorrow, you are never to be in a room alone with Chloe. Not even for a second." Richard blinked in confusion. "Chloe, the girl who came by today?" "Yes. Is something wrong with her?" I wanted to tell him everything about the past life, but the words got stuck in my throat, coming out as I had a really terrible nightmare. He didn't laugh at me. Richard was always like that. Even when things sounded ridiculous, he would listen to me seriously. I described what Chloe might do, framing it as a dream. He said he would be careful. I shook my head. Being careful isn't enough. I slid a piece of paper across the table to him. It was a list of 10 rules I had drafted. As Richard read through them, his brow furrowed deeper and deeper. Sophia, do you know something I don't? I stared into his eyes. I just know that human nature is sometimes much harder to solve than any math equation. He fell silent for a long time, then folded the paper and slipped it into his pocket. I trust you. I'll do it the next day. Chloe officially joined the 6-person AP Calculus prep group. I personally moved the class to the 3rd floor AV room. When Chloe signed the attendance sheet, her fingers hesitated. I stood beside her. Any questions? She looked up, offering a sweet, innocent smile. No, Sophia. You thought of everything. I smiled back. We have to protect our students and our teachers. The voice recorders were standard school equipment. Serial numbers, checkout times, and return logs. Everything was strictly documented. They were meant for resolving classroom disputes, but in my past life nobody had thought to use them. This time I wasn't letting a single detail slip through the cracks. For the next 2 weeks Chloe was on her best behavior. She was so quiet that I almost thought I had successfully rewritten our destiny. But by the 3rd week she started testing the waters. When the bell rang and the other students packed up and left, Chloe stayed behind holding her workbook. Mr. Richard, could you explain this problem to me one more time? Richard glanced at the door. The female teaching assistant I had assigned immediately stepped into the room. I'll stay and listen to that, said with a polite smile. Chloe's expression stiffened. Never mind. I'll just figure it out at home. Another time. She collapsed in the hallway, clutching her stomach right as Richard was walking by. Mr. Richard, the first feels so dizzy. Before Richard could even speak, I stepped out from around the corner with the school nurse right behind me. What is wrong? Let's get you to the clinic. Chloe gasped when she saw me, panic flitting across her face. I think my blood sugar is just low. I'll be fine if I sit down. And then she started sending in late-night messages to Richard on Snapchat. Mr. Richard thought, first, really can't take this pressure anymore. I don't want to live. Can we please just talk just between us? Please don't tell anyone. In my past life, these exact screenshots were leaked into a viral video. If their relationship was totally innocent, why did she only reach out to him? The internet had screamed. This time Richard didn't reply. Instead, he took screenshots and posted them directly into the school administration's group chat, tagging the school counselor and Chloe's homeroom teacher. Within 10 minutes, the school counselor contacted Chloe's parents. When Chloe came to school the next day, her eyes were red and swollen. She marched up to my desk, her voice dropping to a cold whisper. Sophia, I trusted Mr. Richard. Why did you have to turn this into such a massive deal? I looked up because your life is more important than your secrets. She stared at me at that moment. The fragile, victimized mask she wore slipped just for a second. You really know how to play the saint, don't you? I closed my file folder. And you really know how to act. Her expression shifted, but then she quickly lowered her head and let out a soft, mocking laugh. I have no idea what you are talking about. I ignored her, but I knew she wouldn't be able to hold back much longer. A month later, on a Friday afternoon, the parent group chats exploded. I was in the administration office verifying the schedule for the next week when my phone started vibrating violently. Seconds later, someone dropped a link into the school's public forum. The headline made my eyes burn. 18-year-old prep school student breaks down. I am too terrified to go to class after what my math teacher did to me. The thumbnail of the video showed Chloe in her school uniform, her eyes swollen like plums, sobbing into the camera. I hesitated for so long. I didn't know if I should speak up, she whimpered. He is a highly respected teacher, and I am just a student. That night after everyone left, he kept me behind. She didn't finish the sentence, but the silence she left was more damaging than any direct accusation. The comment section was already in a state of absolute fury. Another monster hiding behind a teaching license. The school needs to fire him immediately. It takes so much courage for a young girl to stand up like this. Does Guy have a daughter of his own? Does she know what a creep her father is? My hand shook so violently, I almost dropped my phone. The ghost of the internet mob from my past life was myself through this nightmare. Amber's camera immediately shoved past the doorway, aiming straight at my face. Sophia, as a woman, why is your first instinct to protect your husband instead of supporting a vulnerable student? I looked right into the camera lens. In my past life, this exact question had nailed me to a cross. The moment I tried to defend my husband, the internet branded me as an enabler and an accomplice. This time, I wasn't going to let them control the narrative. I pulled out my phone, unlocked it, and dialed 911 right in front of everyone. Yes, I'd like to report a crime, and we have an active case of extortion, defamation, and malicious slander taking place right now. The entire conference room went dead silent. Chloe's crying abruptly stopped. Amber's smug smile froze on her face. The moment I ended the call, the heavy silence in the conference room shattered. Amber's phone, still broadcasting to thousands of viewers, captured every second of her faltering composure. Her manicured fingers twitched, and the smug, righteous indignation that had painted her face just moments prior melted into a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. End quote. What are you doing? End quote. Mr. Harrison hissed, his voice cracking as he lunged forward, waving his hands frantically as if he could physically snatch the 911 call out of the air. End quote. Sophia, have you lost your mind? We are trying to handle this internally. End quote. End quote. Handle it internally. End quote. I stepped forward, my heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. End quote. You mean sweep it under the rug? You mean force an innocent man to apologize for a crime he didn't commit just to save the school's PR? No, Mr. Harrison. If there's been a crime, we let the authorities handle it. End quote. I turned my gaze to Chloe. The blanket had slipped from her shoulders. Her face was ashen, the manufactured tears drying instantly on her cheeks. The terrified victim act had vanished, replaced by the stark, wide-eyed terror of a teenager who realized she was no longer playing a game with school administrators, but with the law. Sophia. Richard stood up, his voice steady, but his eyes searching. Mind you, he looked exhausted, but the moment he saw the unwavering resolve in my expression, his shoulders relaxed. He remembered the 10 rules. He remembered the promise I made to him on the balcony. He gave me a single, barely perceptible nod. Amber finally recovered her wits. She shoved the phone closer to my face, her voice pitching an octave higher as she tried to salvage her life. Stream. Look at this, everyone. The school administration is trying to intimidate a victim. They're calling the cops to scare a traumatized young girl into silence. This is textbook victim blaming. I didn't flinch. I looked directly into the camera lens. My expression I see if she is a victim. Amber, the police will protect her. They will gather the evidence, pull the security footage, and arrest my husband. But if this is a coordinated extortion attempt, if you are using a minor to manufacture a scandal for TikTok views and a quick settlement, then the police will be very interested in your bank records and direct messages. Amber's hand visibly shook the camera frame, bobbed violently. Turn that off, I commanded, my voice dropping to a dangerous register, or keep it on and let your followers watch you get arrested for trespassing and interfering with an active police investigation. She swallowed hard, her eyes darting between me, the pale Mr. Harrison, and Chloe, who was now biting her thumbnail down to the quick with a sharp flick of her thumb. Amber ended the live stream. The silence that followed the termination of the live stream was heavy, broken only by the sharp, metallic click of Amber's phone sliding into her designer handbag. The room felt smaller now. The righteous, theatrical air that Amber and Chloe had brought into the conference room had evaporated, replaced by the sterile, low-frequency hum of the building's air conditioning. End quote, Sophia, end quote, Vice Principal Harrison said, his voice dropping into a desperate, hushed whisper as he took a step toward me, his palms up in a pleading gesture. End quote, you have to think about the school's reputation. If the police come here, if this gets into the local newspapers, it won't just ruin Richard, it will ruin our enrollment numbers for the next 3 years. We can handle this privately. A quiet settlement, end quote, a quiet settlement for what, Mr. Harrison? I turned to look him dead in the eye. My voice was calm, but it had the weight of a heavy ledger. For a crime that didn't happen? For a lie manufactured by an influencer and a failing student? If you want to protect the school, your first priority should be protecting your faculty from extortion. Outside the heavy double doors, the distant rhythmic wail of a police siren began to cut through the afternoon traffic. Chloe flinched. The blanket that had been draped so carefully over her shoulders slipped down her arm, pooling on the floorboards. She looked at her cousin, her eyes wide, silent, and suddenly very young. The brave, tearful victim from the TikTok video was gone. In her place sat a terrified 18-year-old girl who had never seen the inside of a police cruiser. End quote, Ember, end quote, Chloe whispered, her voice cracking. End quote, you said they'd just pay it. You said the school would offer the settlement before the board meeting, end quote, shut up, Chloe, end quote, Ember hissed under her breath, her manicured fingers twisting the strap of her bag so tightly her knuckles turned white. She didn't look at Chloe. She was looking at the door, her ears tracking the volume of the approaching sirens. The doors to the conference room opened 5 minutes later. 2 uniformed officers and a detective in a dark gray suit stepped into the room. The detective, a woman with sharp, observant eyes and a silver badge pinned to her lapel, looked around the table. Her name tag read Detective Miller. End quote, I'm Detective Miller, County Police, end quote, she said, her voice dry and clinical. End quote, we received a call regarding an active case of extortion and malicious slander. Who is the complainant, end quote, I am, end quote, I said, stepping forward. I pulled a thick white binder from my tote bag and laid it on the table. End quote, my name is Sophia Lynn. I am the administrator of this facility, and this is my husband, Richard Lynn, the AP calculus instructor, end quote. Harrison tried to step between us, his face slick with sweat. End quote, officer, I'm Vice Principal Harrison. This is an internal school disciplinary matter. There's been a misunderstanding, end quote, it's not a misunderstanding, detective, end quote, I interrupted, opening the binder. Tuesday, October 14th at 4:30 p.m., the student Chloe participated in a scheduled SAT prep session in the 3rd floor AV room. Here is the signed attendance sheet. Here is the log sheet for the audio-video recording system, which was turned on at 4:15 p.m. and remained active until 5:45 p.m. 15 minutes after the session concluded. I turned the page showing the high-resolution screenshots of the empty classroom. This is the recording of the room at 5:15 p.m. The exact time Chloe's video claims she was left alone with my husband. As you can see, the room was empty. My husband had already left to attend a department meeting on the 1st floor. Here is the sign-in sheet for that meeting signed by 7 other teachers. Detective Miller leaned over the table, her eyes scanning the documents with a rapid practice focus of a professional. She turned her head to look at Chloe, who was now biting her thumbnail down to the quick, her legs shaking under the table. Where's the medical report of the soft tissue contusion? Miller asked. Right here, Amber said, her voice regaining a bit of its defensive edge as she reached into her bag. My cousin was examined at the urgent care clinic on Wednesday morning. The bruise is documented. The bruise is on her upper right arm, I said, cutting her off. And according to the clinic's report, the injury occurred between 12 and 24 hours prior to the examination. But on Tuesday afternoon, after leaving the AV room, Chloe did not go home. She went to Amber's apartment. I pulled out my phone and displayed a preserved screenshot of a public Snapchat story. This is Chloe's public post from Tuesday evening at 6:30 p.m. She is laughing, wearing a tank top, and there is no mark on her arm. The photo is geotagged at Amber's address. The bruise didn't exist until after she spent 3 hours with her cousin. Amber's breath hitched. She looked at the Snapchat screenshot as if it were a venomous snake. This is a coordinated attempt to extract a $300,000 settlement from the school's insurance policy, I said, looking directly at Detective Miller, and we have the digital trail to prove it. The atmosphere in the conference room had shifted completely. The administrative staff and the few parents who had been shouting in the hallway were now standing silent outside the glass partitions, their faces pressed against the glass, watching the detective go through the binder. End quote, Mr. Harrison, end quote, Detective Miller said, her voice flat. End quote, I need the original digital video files from the 3rd floor AV room for Tuesday afternoon. I want them secured on an external drive immediately, end quote, of course, end quote, Harrison stammered, his face pale as he looked at the security guard. End quote, go get the IT director. Now. And you, end quote, Miller said, turning her attention to Amber. May I see your phone, please? No, Amber said quickly, her voice rising in panic. You don't have a warrant. I'm a member of the press, You're an influencer, Ms. Laurent, Miller said, her voice dropping into a dangerous clinical tone. And right now, you are standing in a school building during a live broadcast accusing a public employee of a felony while a minor is present. If this file contains messages planning this accusation prior to the alleged incident, that is a Class C felony for conspiracy to commit extortion. I can secure your phone now, or I can have a uniformed officer hold you here while I obtain a warrant from the magistrate. It will take 45 minutes, Amber looked at the two uniformed officers standing near the door. Their hands were resting on their utility belts, their faces empty of any expression. She slowly reached into her bag, pulled out her phone, and laid it on the table. Chloe, I said, looking at the girl in the corner. You thought that because you were 18, the school would just pay the money to avoid the scandal. You thought that because the internet always believes the girl, you didn't need to worry about the details, Chloe didn't answer. She was crying now, but were different tears. They weren't the quiet, brave tears she had cried for the camera. They were the frantic, hiccuping sobs of a child who realized the ground beneath her feet was disappearing. My dad, she sobbed, her head dropping onto her knees. My dad didn't want me to do this. He said Mr. Richard was a good man, but Amber said the school had so much money and my college tuition, Chloe, shut up, Amber screamed, lunging across the table toward her cousin. Don't say another word, Ms. Lauren stepped back, the uniform officer said, his hand instantly going to Amber's shoulder, pushing her firmly back into her chair. Do not interfere with the witness, Richard stood up from his chair. Throughout the entire ordeal, he had remained silent, his hands clasped together on the table, his face pale but completely steady. He looked at Chloe, not with anger, but with a deep, sorrowful pity. Chloe, Richard said, his voice quiet and clear, I spent 3 weeks preparing those calculus materials for you. I stayed late because I believed you. Wanted to build a future. I didn't care about the tuition. I cared about your education. Why would you do this? Chloe couldn't look him in the eye. She just buried her face in her arms, her body shaking as the sirens outside finally stopped, their lights still casting red and blue shadows against the white walls of the room. By Monday morning, the school board had convened an emergency closed-door meeting in the main administrative building. Richard and I sat on one side of the mahogany table. Across from us sat the district's legal counsel, the superintendent, and a very quiet, very pale vice principal Harrison, who was currently suspended pending an internal investigation into his conduct. Detective Miller was also present, holding a manila folder containing the preliminary forensic reports from the State Police Division. The digital evidence is ironclad, Miller said, opening the folder. The AV recording from Tuesday afternoon shows the student, Chloe, entering the room at 4:15 p.m. and leaving at 5:30 p.m. There is no physical contact between the instructor and the student at any point. In fact, Mr. Lin spent 30 minutes of the session at the whiteboard while the female teaching assistant, Ms. Davis, sat at the desk near the door. She turned to Harrison. Mr. Harrison, you received a complaint from Amber Laurent on Wednesday morning, correct? Yes, Harrison whispered, his eyes fixed on the table. And you didn't verify the AV logs before calling Mr. Lin into your office and demanding his resignation, I was trying to prevent a public relations disaster, Harrison stammered, his fingers twitching against his tie. The video was already gaining traction on TikTok. We had parents calling the front desk every 5 minutes. I thought if we got him to step down temporarily, we could buy some time to investigate, You wanted him to take the blame to save your own position, I said, my voice cold as ice. In my husband's first 15 years of teaching, he has never had a single complaint. Yet your first was to sacrifice his dignity to quiet the media. If we hadn't established the 10 rules, if we hadn't recorded every second of those sessions, my husband would be in a county jail right now, The superintendent, an older man with graying hair and a serious face, sighed and closed his folder. Mrs. Lin is correct, the superintendent said, looking at Harrison. Your actions were a direct violation of district protocol. Effective immediately, your contract with this district is terminated. The board will be issuing a formal public apology to Mr. Lin this afternoon, which will be sent to every parent and local media outlet, He turned to Richard. Mr. Lin, we are deeply sorry for the distress this has caused your family. We hope you will consider returning to your position after the holiday, Richard looked at me, then at the empty chair where Harrison had Saturday, I will return, Richard said quietly, but on one condition. The 10 rules must be implemented across all departments in this school. No teacher should ever be placed in a position where their survival depends on a standard she said. We must protect our staff as much as we protect our students. Agreed, the superintendent said, nodding once. The board will vote on the policy change this afternoon, The trial of Amber Laurent and Chloe began 3 months later in the county courthouse. The courtroom was packed with local journalists, teachers, and a few high school students who had once shared Chloe's videos, but the atmosphere was very different now. The internet mob that had once screamed for Richard's head had turned its focus onto Amber. The headline on the local news station wasn't "Brave Girl Speaks Out" anymore. It was "The Anatomy of an Extortion: How an Influencer Staged Abuse Scandal for TikTok." Views. I sat in the front row of the gallery holding Haley's hand. My daughter was back in school. The Creep's daughter paper had been thrown in the trash, and her classmates had slowly, awkwardly apologized to her after the school's public statement was released. She was still quiet, still slightly guarded, but the fear in her eyes had been replaced by a quiet, solid pride in her father. On the witness stand, Chloe looked entirely drained. She had pleaded guilty to misdemeanor filing of a false police report and conspiracy to commit extortion, agreeing to testify against her cousin in exchange for a suspended sentence and community service. And quote, Amber told me we wouldn't get caught. And quote, Chloe whispered into the microphone, her voice flat. And quote, she said the school's insurance company had a special budget for these kinds of cases. And quote, she said. And quote, she said we'd split the money 70/30ths. I just wanted to go to college. My family, we didn't have the tuition. And quote, and the bruise on your arm. And quote, the prosecutor asked. And quote, Amber did it. And quote, Chloe said, her head dropping. And quote, she used a heavy wooden hairbrush to hit my arm after I got to her apartment. She said the medical report had to look real or the lawyers wouldn't take the case. And quote, a murmur went through the gallery. Amber sat at the defense table, her face frozen in a tight, pale mask. Her lawyer tried to argue that she was simply trying to help a traumatized young girl, but the state's evidence was overwhelming. The police had recovered the deleted direct messages from Amber's phone. If we get the math teacher, one message from Amber to Chloe Reed dated 3 weeks before the incident, the school will settle fast. He's got a clean record and the VP is a coward. Just get him to stay late once. I'll handle the rest. The jury took less than 2 hours to reach a verdict. Amber Laurent was found guilty on all counts of conspiracy to commit wire fraud, extortion, and contributing to the delinquency of a minor. She was sentenced to 4 years in the state women's correctional facility, her social media accounts seized and permanently deleted by court order. As the bailiffs led her out of the courtroom, her hands cuffed behind her back, she looked at me. There was no righteousness left in her face. There was only the empty, hollow stare of a predator that had finally been caught in its own trap. I didn't smile. I didn't feel a rush of triumphant joy. I just squeezed Haley's hand, stood up, and walked out into the bright afternoon sunlight. The spring in our town was beautiful. The cherry blossoms along the river walk blooming in pale, pink clusters that drifted through the air like warm snow. It was a Friday evening. The house was quiet. The smell of roasted chicken and garlic potatoes filling the warm kitchen. Haley was in her room studying for her chemistry exam. The soft sound of her music filtering through the door. She was laughing on the phone with a friend, a sound that I had feared I would never hear again in this lifetime. I walked out onto the balcony holding 2 mugs of hot tea. Richard was standing by the railing looking out at the sunset. He was wearing his gray sweater, his glasses resting on the bridge of his nose, his hair slightly silvered by the light of the evening sun. He looked tired, but it was the healthy, satisfied exhaustion of a man who had spent the day helping 80 students understand the beauty of limits and integrals. Here, I said, handing him a mug. Thanks, babe, he said, taking it. He took a sip, then reached out his other hand to pull me close, his arm wrapping around my waist with a solid warm pressure. The weather is perfect tonight. It is, I said, leaning my head against his shoulder. Sophia, he said after a long silence. The district coordinator told me today that 5 other schools in the state are adopting the 10 rules next semester. They're calling it the Lynn Protocol. I smiled, my eyes tracking the flight of a small bird through the branches of the birch tree near the fence. It's a good name. I still don't understand, he whispered, his hand gently stroking my hair. That night, when you brought me the list, you looked so terrified, Sophia, like you had seen a ghost. I looked at his face, the clean white shirt, the black-rimmed glasses, the chalk dust on his cuffs that would never be stained by a lie again. I did see a ghost, Richard, I said quietly looking into his eyes, but we laid it to rest. He didn't ask any more questions. He didn't need to. He just held me tighter as the sun finally dipped behind the hills, the warm golden light fading into a deep peaceful blue that covered our home like a shield.